Why is it astounding that pi appears in the Bible? At first glance, it doesn't seem nothing special. Pi was a very well-known number in the ancient times. However, and as we'll see, pi appears in Genesis 1:1 as 3.1415, a precision that was unknown in the antiquity. Archimedes was who went further in that time. He gave the approximation pi equals 22/7 equals 3.1428, exact until the 3.14. He obtained it by the method of exhaustion, that is better you can do without using mathematics of the infinite. So his achievement was monumental. It confirmed that 3.14, the approximation used in ancient times for pi, was right. But the book of Genesis, by then, had more than 500 years of existence. It's only centuries later, during the Christian era, that the method of Archimedes, developed independently in India and China, allowed to get more precise approximations of the exact value of pi. But we are at more than 1000 years from the moment when the book of Genesis was written. The most ancient document giving such a precise value for pi is from the 2nd century AD. Ptolemy, in his Almagest, gives a value 3.1416, but he doesn't explain the way he used to reach it. And 4 centuries later, first in China and then in India, more digits were computed through very detailed and complex calculations based in geometrical approximations, a similar method to the one of Archimedes, but taken to the limit. In the Western world, similar methods were used to compute pi with major precision just as late as in the 17th century. But we are at a distance of more than 2500 years from the time when the book of Genesis was written. In this same century, after the coming of the mathematics of the infinite, for the first time we were able to compute, by a simple method, hundreds of digits for the number pi. Today we can compute pi with unlimited precision, and we have computed trillions of digits. But for Yahweh it was enough to put this 15 after the 3.14 to let us see very clearly that the true author of the book of Genesis knew the number pi with more precision than any human of that time and of any of the 10 following centuries. Why is it astounding that the number E appears in the Bible? This is much easier to explain. The number E appears in John 1:1, a book written during the 1st century of the Christian era, but the mere existence of the number E was only proposed by the mathematicians of the world in the first half of the 17th century, more than 1500 years later, and the computation of its numerical value had to wait for other 50 years. So, or it is a coincidence, or Yahweh had everything planned from the beginning. And we can take for granted that John, who wrote the book, knew nothing about the number E. Why in these 2 verses? Why not in other 2? It happens that these are 2 very special verses. Genesis 1:1 is the first verse of the Bible and of the Old Testament. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In its original Hebrew version, it has 7 words, 28 letters, and a gematria value of 2701, a number that is full of geometrical and numerical implications, but it's over the reach of this video to go further in this topic. Right now, let's just observe this. Of course, Genesis 1:1 is a very special verse. It is the first verse of the Bible. John 1:1 requires a longer explanation, but it's easy to understand. As we all know, there is an Old Testament and a New Testament. There's 5 books that are the cornerstone of the Old Testament, the Torah, and 5 books that are the cornerstone of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels and the book of the Acts of the Apostles. It's natural that, if God placed 2 special numbers, he did it in the initial verse of the Old Testament and in the initial verse of the New Testament. As we have seen, pi is effectively placed in the first verse of the Old Testament. Why then the number E is not placed in Matthew 1:1, the verse that starts the New Testament? Actually, unlike what happens with the Old Testament, where Genesis is in every sense the first book, in the New Testament it is arguable to claim that Matthew comes before John, or that some Gospel comes before another. The ordering of the books comes from human tradition, is not part of the Bible itself, but we have a clear sign and will understand it better if we read the 4 verses 1:1 of the 4 Gospels. Matthew 1:1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Luke 1:1, for as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. While Matthew talks about the generation of Jesus Christ, and Mark and Luke announce, each one in their own way, that they will tell the gospel of Jesus Christ, John talks about the beginning of all things, the beginning par excellence, not of the beginning of a certain book or gospel, like Mark does. John is writing about the same issue than Genesis 1:1, the beginning of all things. John is taking us to the very moment of creation, and there's no other verse in the Bible, out of Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1, where the central topic is a description of the beginning of all things. In other cases, like in Proverbs 8:22 or Revelation 3:14, the beginning of all things is mentioned, but as part of other question that is the central topic being discussed. The same thing happens in some passages of Ecclesiastes, Isaiah, Micah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John himself, 2 Thessalonians, Titus, Hebrews, 2 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation. Or in other parts of the Bible are mentioned many beginnings, the beginning of this or that month or year, the beginning of this or that kingdom, the beginning of this or that feast, the principle of wisdom, the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the beginning of the predication of Paul in this or that city, but only in Genesis 1:1 and in John 1:1 is mentioned the beginning of all things, the very moment of creation, as a central and exclusive topic of the verse. So the election of John 1:1 is not arbitrary or capricious. Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1 are the two only verses in the Bible that describe to us the beginning of all things, and are two initial and founding verses. Genesis 1:1 is the first verse of all the Bible and the first of the Old Testament, and John 1:1 could be properly and perfectly considered as the first of the New Testament. And if there still was any doubt, these are the only two verses in the Bible that refer in any way to creation and start with the words "in the beginning." In Genesis 1:1, Bereshit, in the beginning written in Hebrew, the language used to create the Old Testament. And in John 1:1, Enarchi, in the beginning written in Greek, the language used to write the New Testament. Each one of these verses gives us, for each one of these languages and for each of the testaments, a particular version of the story of the beginning. Now let's observe this curious connection between the biblical creation and the universe as we know it. As we advanced in our scientific knowledge of the world, we have discovered that the universe is built of the two constants E and pi. Many of the fundamental laws of physics and other sciences rely over and over again on these two mathematical constants. Is God telling us that in the beginning of all things He put the numbers E and pi as the fundamental building blocks of His creation? What best verses than the verses in the beginning to encode E and pi?